The first speaker, we'll start with John Halamka. He's a physician trained in emergency medicine and bioengineering, over 25 years of experience in shaping healthcare information strategy. He's the president of the Mayo Clinic Platform. He's leading the charge in transforming healthcare by combining AI with clinical expertise. For our online audiences, please submit your questions during the talk. Let's welcome John as our first speaker.
And I hate podiums. You know, you want to wander, you want to engage. It's always really hard to follow a legend. So thank you for those remarks, because they inspired my remarks, which is he challenged all of us to embrace this difficult next 10 years of data curation, of AI that is going to be predictable, is going to be resilient, is going to be potentially fair and appropriate and useful. But how are we going to do it? And so you outlined in your closing slide a few ideas, but let me start more broadly, which is we all know that our models, predictive or generative or whatever comes next, will have to be based on large amounts of data. There's a challenge with that. And I know there are many data scientists in the room, so much of our data is flawed, incomplete, fractured. And what do I mean by that? So, Rasu, it's 3 a.m. on a Sunday, and you have abdominal pain, and you're sitting with a registration clerk. So what's your race, ethnicity? Right? Think about some of the things we have to now record in the medical record, and you have to understand who recorded them, why recorded them, what's the utility and the potential veracity of the data gathered. I will tell you almost all social determinants of health data are awful. And if you go to a world-renowned institution, one of those in our city, are you going to get representative data of rural America, of those with low incomes, or those with challenges in their socioeconomic lives? Well, some, but it won't be a rich data set. Sometimes, if I look at the last 40 years, because we've worked together for more than 40 years, the problems were technical. And that is, we were reflecting back in the days when 110 or 300 baud modems were the best you could do. Most of you don't even know what that is. Or 500 megs would be some storage that the National Library of Congress would have, but who else would need it? I would argue it's 2024 and our technical challenges no longer exist. In effect, we have as much storage and compute as there is, say, electricity to power. And by the way, the future is not in AI. The future is in power companies. That's what's really going to grow. Sometimes the issues are policy-based. You talk about Rob Califf, the FDA, and of course, protection of privacy and all the rest. There are organizations coming together in government and in private industry to address a lot of the policy challenges. I serve as chair of the Coalition for Health AI, which is now 4,000 companies working together with the FDA and the White House and government, academia, and industry, figuring out the guidelines and the guardrails for the appropriate use of data and creation of models. So I think policy is going to be in a reasonably good direction or shape in the next year to two. But a real problem we all have is, I'm going to call it psychiatry. If I were to go to a leading medical institution and say, would you share your data, de-identified, privacy protected, consented, for the benefit of humanity, what kind of answers do you think you're going to get most of the time? Oh, no, it's our data or our research. It's proprietary to us. So how do we change that paradigm? When I was hired 4 years ago at Mayo, the question I asked was, what if you told institutions across the world, we'll curate your data, and by that I mean a more technical curation, but leave it inside your organization where you have governance and you have ultimate technical control of it. Would you agree to work with other organizations is as long as there was bidirectional data reciprocity? You would bring 100 million MRIs, but then collaborators around the world will bring 100 million MRIs. So in fact, you're going to get more than you give. It's going to be a virtuous collaboration in a decentralized and federated way for the creation of the world's most global data set for predictive and generative AI. So we started at Mayo, and there were some interesting challenges. As Rasu knows, de-identifying data is an imperfect science. I can take a problem list or a medication list, an allergy list, labs. If I remove the name, the address, the phone number, the medical record number, it's pretty much de-identified, because a problem list that says, patient with heart disease and cancer, well, that describes millions and millions of people. The challenge is the notes, the text reports, the diagnostic studies. Because what if a note which has been anonymized, there's no name, no address, no phone number, just starts, and this former president of the United States. Okay, well, what we would call the bin size, the number of people who qualify for that job role, pretty small and pretty easy to re-identify. Mayo has billions of notes. We had to use natural language processing and machine learning techniques to read those billions of notes and look for job role, geography, familial relationships, even things like dates. Because what if the medical record said, and this patient had a child on this given date? Well, you could assume that by looking at a birth registry, a newspaper article, you might be able to figure out who that was. So we had to do things like date shifting, ensuring temporality of the record is intact, but shifting every single date in the record by a specific amount in a more randomized way over a population. So we did that with 10 million patients, and that was a start. But the problem, even though Mayo has huge amounts of what I'll call deep data, it's not only the text, it's also the images, it's also the telemetry, the digital pathology, and the genomics, it may not have the heterogeneity, the same problem I mentioned with Boston, because Mayo has Minnesota, Florida, Arizona. Does that include rural Kentucky? No. So we then went to other organizations, Mercy Health. Mercy Health, Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, 15 million patients. Said, would you do the following? Would you de-identify your data? We'll give you the tools. We'll put it in an industry standard format called OMOP and build a federated learning approach by which you can federate our data, we can federate your data, we can learn together, we can validate together. And Mercy said, yes, but there's certain governance that we want control of and local hosting. Mercy is a Catholic healthcare system. And some of you may know that in Catholic healthcare systems, there are certain rules about clinical care, use of data, and that kind of thing. So that's fine. We respect that. Then we went to UHN, Toronto, Albert Einstein, Brazil, the country of Singapore, the country of South Korea, India. And recently, we have just added Kenya, Nigeria, and Ethiopia, and there's a whole long tail of organizations and countries in the US and internationally who have agreed. They will put aside some of the psychiatry as long as the data is decentralized, controlled, and governed by them, and they participate in a reciprocity for mutual benefit. So that's great. So we're looking at 2024, 2025, say 100 million patients in that network. So we can all start to use these kinds of networks for the creation of novel models. But there's a problem, which you guys have identified. How do we know a model works? How do we know if it's fair, appropriate, valid, effective, and safe? Well, you need to test it. And mathematically, you can test a lot of the predictive AI against different data sets and say, oh, it seemed to work pretty well. We'll give it an area under the curve, and we'll decide that the model is sufficient for purpose. And every model will be biased, and that's okay, as long as you understand what the bias is and mitigate the bias. Quick example of what I mean. Mayo has an incredible model for predicting cardiac mortality, and it works great if your body mass index is less than 31, and horribly if your body mass index is above 35. Is it ethical to use that model? Yes, on patients with a body mass index under 31, mitigate the bias. But here's a problem we're all going to have. Generative AI, and you guys highlighted this, even with curated data, it's very hard with generative AI to know if a given answer to a prompt is credible. So we're going to have an interesting issue, and one is, okay, human in the loop, human nearby, but there may be other techniques, and this will be very interesting for all of you to explore. What if you take the entire National Library of Medicine PubMed dataset and create a knowledge graph, and imagine that every time generative AI produces an answer, you compare that to a knowledge graph and give a, say, credibility score to the generative AI. Now, this is this is speculative, right? I'm just thinking of ways you could imagine, because if you gave something a prompt and then you got back the credibility score of this particular result is 20%, you'd probably say, oh boy, that journal may not exist. That study may not have been done. As opposed to if the credibility score was 80 or 90%, at least you'd consider it sort of reasonable as part of decision making. So I give you that challenge because if we're going to do what Larry has asked, and that is we're all going to work together for an AI future that does no harm, right? We all want to take that digital Hippocratic oath. We can get the data, we can create and validate the models, we can protect privacy, and we can overcome the reluctance, the willingness to take a risk, the willingness to innovate and try is something that's an imperative for us all. I will conclude by saying, I think 2025 is going to be the greatest time in history for all of us because we have the technology we need, we have an urgency to do this. It is the only way we're going to get those longevity curves that you showed supplied with the medical care we all need to have humans augmented by AI. So we have no choice but to do this. And I look forward to being potentially almost as a Forrest Gump of healthcare and healthcare IT that you were. So thanks, and let me turn it over to the next speaker.